history peeps, welcome to another world history video. I'm Mr. Johnson again, and we're getting you set up for the new year. So first one we're going to talk about is going to help you with writing essays. If there's anything we're going to spend more time doing this year, it's going to be essays. So one of the first skills you have to do in writing in this class is establish a context. And so that's the reason for these videos. You've heard context before. It establishes or sets the situation for whatever comment or other information is coming. Without it, you really don't know what's going on. The most famous example of context you might know is this. And if you don't, you really should. In fact, watch them now. They're really worth it, but only 4, 5, and 6. Don't worry about the other ones. Without that context, though, you don't know what's going on in the beginning of the movie. You're just kind of like weird laser beams and dudes in white and black and someone just got choked. You don't really have the complete picture of what's going on. Another example is this meme. Right. So the point of this meme is the whole joke is establishing context. It talks about one number. And I know, I'm sorry, when I go through a joke and talk about it, it becomes less funny, but it's instructional and it helps you. So one reason we need this is because the difference of the two things. That number 4 has two contexts or multiple depending on what we're talking about. $4, not a big deal. 4 murders, obviously a big deal. So it's making a joke out of the context. Without knowing it, it gives us two parallels of how bad something is. It creates the meaning that you need to understand. And with context, we need to understand what's going on to set the stage, to prep what we're going to be talking about. For your essays, it's going to prep what you're going to talk about in an essay. For these videos, it's prepping you for the year coming ahead so that when we talk about China in the 12th century, you have some background. So that's context. So why all this topic and all this time on context? Well, that's why I'm doing these videos. We're going to start the year at 1200 CE, and all these videos are before that. And the purpose is, so there's some things in these things that help you move from the history beforehand to 1200, because otherwise, just starting at a random year, nothing does that. That would be like starting talking about your life at age 12 or 14, and wait, what about all the stuff beforehand? And it's like, no, none of that matters. Are you kidding? That's totally relevant to who you are as a person. So that's the reason for these videos, and that's why I've spread them out, because the big one is this one, and it's China.
China.
So here we go. If there is any regional history we need to better fully understand, I would argue that one could never hurt in studying China. They begin their history with a legendary dynasty starting over 4,000 years ago. Legend has it that the first dynasty, or a heretical rule of a place by a people, by like a family, was the Zhou Dynasty. And they began after a great flood. And so first off, historians hear that flood story and think, okay, everyone's got a flood story. Welcome to the game, China. But here's the thing. Only recently, but recently enough, within the last 20 years, archaeologists have actually discovered evidence of a great flood of this one valley. And what happened was there was an earthquake, and it caused a massive rock slide that blocked off the source of this river. And so it filled up with a lake, and it was a nice little river valley with a good solid river, so people built their houses and stuff on it and settled. And then another earthquake happened and knocked all of that rock slide out. And those rocks then fell away from that lake and caused a massive flood of that valley. So there's actually evidence that this happened, rather than just great flood story narrative or everything. But other things that came from this was the earliest known forms of writing, called proto-writing. And you're going to see some scripts like this. Now, the reason why it's called proto-writing is that each character, we believe, represents something. Like a word specific, not like there's parts to the word. And so basically it's more like emojis So each symbol has a meaning versus an alphabet where each symbol has a corresponding sound or vowel or word or letter. So they were on the back of tortoise shells. That was the original stuff that they used to write with. And so that dynasty that existed before the Zhou was called the Shang Dynasty. Whether or not they actually existed is still up for debate. However, we do see the Zhou Dynasty being the first central dynasty over China. And they claimed rule on what was called the Mandate of Heaven. And the Mandate of Heaven is probably one of the most important aspects of understanding Chinese history, particularly its political and social histories, because it means that the emperor, whoever is in charge of China, has the blessings of the gods. And because of that, they need to rule with that blessing. So they need to be benevolent to the people, and the people need to respect the emperor because they all work together and the emperor is blessed by the gods. If the emperor is weak and awful and not working, he could get overthrown. And if he's overthrown, he lost the mandate of heaven. But the idea is whoever's in charge has it. So challenges to authority should not be there unless, of course, they're successful. I know that seems a little confusing, but that's how they rolled. And that's how they understood that by ruling, you were blessed by the gods. Now, as the Zhou grew fractured and weak over time, the first real emperor over all of China emerged after a warring period. And so in 230 BCE, a warlord conquered the fractured states of China and unified under the Qin Dynasty, Qin, but it's pronounced Qi, and that's where we get China. So the emperor, Qin Shi Huang, oh my gosh, laugh it up. Let me try this again. So the first emperor, Qin Shi Huangdi, ruled by harsh legalist principles, and legalism was one of their ways to rule their country. It focused on strict law abiding as well as harsh punishments for anyone who broke the law. While he was able to wield power over all of China, he did so under a very authoritarian and brutal governance. He burned books that weren't following his teachings of legalism. He tried to squash out other faiths and other religions and other things that might challenge him. He drank mercury as a way to live longer and was obsessed with the afterlife to such a degree that he created an army of terracotta warriors made by craftsmen to accompany him into the afterlife. And they were not discovered until the 1970s. Over 10,000 individual soldiers were created, also along with horsemen, chariots, generals, litters, all specific types of things, and everything was ornate and detailed all the way down to the armor and the equipment. However, when he dies, his son takes over, tries to maintain order, and instead completely fails, and China descends into a civil war. With a few years of civil war, a new general comes to power and takes over all of China, unifying it into the Han Dynasty in 206 BCE. If the Western world looks at the Roman Empire as the foundational civilization of the European world, the Han Dynasty was the foundational Chinese dynasty for a unified China. China won't remain unified from here on out, but it started the process with the Han. It lasted from 206 BCE roughly to about 220 BC, so 400 years, approximately almost the same time as the Pax Romana, which we'll talk about in a little bit, because when we get to Rome, man, I'm going to lose it because I love, sorry, focus on China. Okay, cool. So, back to China. It lasted for about 400 years, and they were the ones that started the Great Wall. And the reason why they built the Great Wall are invasions from the nomadic peoples in the north. And the wall was not necessarily a wall to keep them out. It was to prevent them from escaping with all the loot. So, in a sense, it was made more of a deterrent to escape with all the stuff that they just stole, rather than an ability to block them from coming in. It will go through several renovations and improvements, and the one you see today is from the Ming Dynasty in the 14 to 1600s. So, the Han Dynasty saw the beginning of the Silk Road, which was an informal road network that traded from China to Mesopotamia. It became so effective that the Romans were wearing silk. Sorry, I know I went back to Rome again, but there was actually one really cool thing. It was so bad that all the Roman women were wearing silk, and all the Roman men, these very conservative, women need to be virtuous and basically not seen and put in corners and all that kind of stuff. They couldn't handle the clothes the women were wearing because the silk, was a much more form-fitting than those togas. So, yeah, but What that tells us is silk was that frequently traded in the ancient world. So there was connections to China. It may not be direct. So China, though, because of that silk, becomes the destination for the rest of the world in trade. So China, it further brings them to this belief that they are the center of the world, or the Middle Kingdom. That, of all of this stuff about China, is one of the lessons to impart to you as we study more and more about China. But from this wealth brought by trade, they organized a massive bureaucracy with a civil service exam that tried to create a merit-based system of citizen scholars that were also like gentry, wealthy, well off, and open to anybody who could pass the test. However, there was plenty of examples of cheating. The wealthy could still afford classes. The test was 3 days long and far away. So the wealthy still had an advantage, but the idea behind it was something that will continue throughout China as a way to prop up and say that the government and governance is actually a noble and important pursuit of the citizenry. So more about China as a whole, starting with the Han, but also talking about Chinese social order. So most of Chinese society will remain this way for most of its history, up until 1949. So at the top was the emperor. Next up would have been the bureaucrats, that scholar gentry that would advise the emperor. Next would be the nobility and elite that would own land. There would be then craftsmen and artisans, pretty close to the peasantry. And then with merchants, usually at the bottom.
Merchants were at the bottom? That makes no sense. They made the most money.
Jerk. All right, well, ignoring them. With few exceptions, throughout most of Chinese history, merchants were seen like today's used car salesmen. And what I mean by that is they made the money off the work of others. They never made anything themselves. And so the Chinese saw them as basically profiteering on other people's labor. Farmers, on the other hand, they were the source of wealth and food.
Oh my god, really? They were just basic peasants. What could they do?
Really? Okay. What could they have done? They could have rebelled because, say, look, history is not simple. It's not some one-size-fits-all lesson and we can just take something out of it and move on, and that's all we've learned. The social system in China has always been fragile. And what I mean by that is you had the nobility trying to rise up to the top, either getting part of the imperial family or eventually trying to become the imperial family by overthrowing the emperor. And then you also had peasants who were trying to get something on the nobility because they needed either more land, better wages, less taxes. They were trying to fight for power with the nobility. And see, here's the thing. The peasantry, if they believed in the government, would prop up the emperor with support of the nobles. However, if one of those two groups got too upset with the emperor, they would revolt. Popular rebellions will be very common throughout most of China. And what you're going to see is those popular uprisings are what are going to bring down dynasties. And that's exactly what happened to the Han in the Yellow Turban Rebellion in the latter part of their empire. In later dynasties, rebellions will be critical to their ruin, such with the Tang Dynasty in the 900s. You have ones even later. We'll talk about the Taiping Rebellion and the most disastrous rebellion in history. Something like 10 to 20 million people were killed in all of this. So when we talk about popular uprising and the people of China, the peasants, while not always organized, can really change how things progressed. And when any emperor was overthrown successfully, they once again lost the mandate of heaven. Another important aspect of dynastic rule was urbanization. After the fall of the Han, the Three Kingdoms period of China saw disunity bring decentralization and the shrinking of cities. So these cities, and we're talking in Han China, would have pushed towards the millions. Rome hit 1 million people too at the change of the millennia, we'll put it at Caesar's time at 33 BCE. Rome was probably at 1 million people. China probably had at least a couple that were 1 million already. We were talking about the most populous place in the world at the time. So they had cities. Eventually, the capital of China would have over 3 million people in the city and around it in total. Usually about 1 million in the actual city, and then about 2 million in the outskirts surrounding it nearby. That's 3 million people. To give you an understanding, Fredericksburg itself has maybe something like 50,000 people, and Spotsy and Stafford have in total, all of them combined, 300,000. Fairfax County, where I grew up, had 1 million people. And that city alone had 3 million in and around its outskirts. In the 1st century. So we're talking still, once again, size and getting food, sewage, water. I mean, not getting sewage. But all of those things in the 1st century is quite difficult and an impressive scale. So anyway, with the fall of the Han, the Three Kingdoms period sees a lot of infighting and war. But by 589, one of them succeeds over the other two, and it creates the Zhou Dynasty, established by Emperor Wen. See if you can find a pattern. Here's why I'm doing these videos, is because, once again, this pattern is going to continue. So, this new dynasty began massive reorganization and building projects, most notably the Grand Canal connecting the north and the south. Oh, I did this backwards. Oh well, we'll figure it out. So, they connected the two parts of China, the two major areas, the food-growing southern to the more harsher but easier climate. So it's easier to live in, but it's harsher to grow crops, and connected them. And so you now had more cities grow up along this Grand Canal. The problem was the emperor would spend all his time on this Grand Canal, and look how that looks in this little clip. So yeah, partying on the boat with everybody else starving or being poor doesn't really work too well. So after some failed military attempts into Korea, and the second emperor being relatively unpopular, massive peasant revolts destroys the dynasty after only 2 emperors, 2 generations. So hey, Qin was 1 generation, now we got 2 going on. But it gave way to the Tang Dynasty. And the Tang Dynasty would be the major golden age of China. So once again, that continuity, that pattern in China, you got a dynasty that reestablishes power, probably pretty harsh, not as effective, falls, a bigger one takes over and lasts a lot longer. So during the Tang Dynasty, China reached into Central Asia, but was checked by Muslim armies at the Balas of the Taos River. Fun little fact for later, because of that battle, all of a sudden, the Muslims were able to make paper, like they found out about it or figured something out. And Baghdad becomes the major paper producing area and all that, but we'll talk about that later. They had invaded parts of Vietnam and brought back a new type of rice called champa rice. And because of this variety, it grew more frequently, more harvests, as well as higher yields. And that spurred population in China. And so the Chinese cities started to sprout up even more. And this led to a growth of the state, also adherence to central authority, and more rigid customs. And here's where we get into some of the more interesting customs. It is in the latter Tang Dynasty that footbinding began. Footbinding is the practice of wrapping a young girl's feet. Footbinding is the practice of wrapping a young girl's feet, usually between the ages of 7 and 9, and wrapping them in hot water and pulling the foot together and breaking the arch of the foot. And so what happens is this part's broken, and if this was the ball of her foot and this is the heel, they would be brought together. And so she would foot into, the ideal was a 6-inch shoe. So 6-inch shoe. That's how much she'd fit into. Theories abound as to why it began, whether to keep women in the home because they could no longer walk without support, or they needed a cane, or there was a sexual benefit to men. What we do know is that the wealthier families did this to their daughters, and it became kind of a standard if you were going to marry into a wealthier house that women would be footbound. If you were poor and you needed female labor, you probably didn't bind your woman's foot, but there's no way she's going to be able to rise the ranks or advance your family with any form of wealth because of this. So, and it will exist into the 20th century in rural parts of China. Other things about the patriarchy is that women were expected to be virtuous, quiet, with proper countenance and merit. She was followed and was submissive to her husband. The husband was to respect her in the home. But public life was really not something for women. They were allowed to congregate with each other if allowed. But the idea was a woman was subordinate to 3 different men in her life. First, it was her father in her youth, then her husband in maturity, and her son in old age. So that was the lot in life for women in ancient China and medieval China as well. With regard to Chinese religion, Confucianism has been the main method of understanding how to interact with others. There's a sense of God as their God, but nothing really organized or derived into a central deity or spirit until Buddhism comes around. And even then, it's not really clear about what is a divine head. So they have Taoism, which is another way they understand and interpret the world. So all 3 of these go into forming the Chinese religions and how they view all the different aspects of religion. What we need to know in this class for understanding, though, is while Confucianism and Buddhism directly fought one another for basically state control, how was this going to be organized? Taoism was pretty much the home religion in the background that everyone believed it had a spiritual side. So the idea was that you were Confucian in public and in order, and then Taoist at home and in nature. So to simplify what Taoism, or to simplify what Confucianism is the term filial piety. Bing! Yep, I know. That's a word to know. You're going to need to know this. Know that word, okay. Wink, wink. Yeah, know the word, right? So filial piety. So what that means is everyone treats their relationships with someone else as a familial, close relationship that they honor, no matter what side of that relationship you are on. I'm a teacher, you're a student. So our relationship is teacher and then subordinate student. You must respect me because I am your superior, and I must respect you and do what I should as a good teacher. And so for me personally, this is one of those examples. I mean, that way I don't have to do anything for the rest of the year. Just kidding, I will be. But I respect you, you respect me, and we have a good filial and pious relationship. But it's also the same within the home. You know, you have husband to wife, you have parent to child, these relationships, all the way up then to the emperor and people. The emperor acts within care and concern for the people, and the people act with care and concern to serve the emperor. And along with this, ceremony and ritual bestows that honor. So there would be ceremonies. There might be like opening of school day ceremonies, similar to what we have, but not much more formalized, regimented, and everyone respects. Like no one doesn't comply or anything. So that was Confucianism. Buddhism, however, gave women a near equal place with men and was in contrast to Confucianism. Buddhism saw the purpose of life more as a journey of understanding with some ritual, mainly through the eightfold path of improving oneself and knowing the 4 noble truths, which are all life is suffering, possessions lead to suffering, the object of life is to rid themselves of suffering, and follow the eightfold path to release yourself of that suffering. So Buddhism generally had a decentralized ruling system when China was ruled by Taoists, which happened in the early Tang Dynasty. But after that point, it was almost always Confucian, because what happens is by having a Buddhist leader, not many people feel that that leader is strong, powerful, or the center of their faith. And Confucianism, you gotta listen to the emperor. It's part of the way, W-E-I, I think it's called, or the when, the subservience and order that's kept there. Not doing that with Buddhism became kind of difficult of having that leader. So the next one then is Taoism. And Taoism is going to form a lot about China, because as they viewed things and tried to be more in harmony with nature, they discovered all kinds of cool stuff. So Taoism's purpose advocated living in harmony with nature. And while doing so, and here it must follow the way, or the Tao, of nature, to ride its winds and waves however they come, and be flexible. And it's basically seen as, if you need understanding, don't go to books, don't go to introspection. Look outside, look at nature. You know, you could say, look at the ants. All of them work to a bigger and greater thing than themselves. Be more like the ants. Or look at the brook of water. Water doesn't matter and care about where it's going. The water just flows. Be more like the water. And that's how they would understand their lessons from nature. It's not this wishy-washy hippie stuff where they hug a tree and lick it and then be like, oh, wow, I know what the tree's feeling. It's more understand what the lessons from nature can teach us about our own lives. So that was more the spiritual side there. In terms of dealing with other states, China developed what's called the tributary system, particularly in the Tang Dynasty. And what that was is that they recognized trade and peace were preferable and cheaper than war and invasion. Who knew? And what they would do is they would make deals with the surrounding nomadic peoples that would normally be subject to invading them and ask for tribute. And here's how this worked, because it was a really cool system. You would ask them to come to the emperor and kowtow. And kowtowing is where you display yourself. You have your arms out, your forehead down, all the way to the floor in submission to the emperor. The emperor would, acknowledge this and say, okay, cool, you check out. Here is a little of what we can offer you. And then you would be offering your tribute to them. And in being a more nomadic people, you would be like, maybe horses, leather, wool, more raw materials. And as you left going back home, you started looking at the goods you got and you realized you got a lot more goods in value than you gave. And really, it was like the Chinese were extorting themselves. You honor us and say we're in charge and we're better than you, and we'll honor you back by giving you more stuff so you don't invade us. Because, once again, if you're centered in these cities, it's expensive to keep an army, and it's expensive to maintain walls, and it's expensive to really be able to police a large place like China. So it was more profitable to give out from their abundance than it was to fight back and repair. And so this whole system, the tributary system, will be another major part of China. So, finally, China, through its early dynasties, was the most significant region of the world. They had the largest population, the most technological developments, starting with porcelain and silk, and then later into technologies like woodblock print, printing presses, paper, locks and canals to raise boats, cartography, a compass in the 10th century, and paper money, joint stock companies, guilds, and blast furnaces to make better metals. This is all stuff they came up with prior to the 10th century. So this is a lot of innovations. The Taoists, by the way, were looking for a substance to help with eternal life and invented gunpowder. And yes, the irony is not missed on that one. But they had the strongest economy. They had the most productive industries and government departments and organizations that would be rivaled only by the dawn of industrialized Europe. So that's how organized they were over a large area and able to keep rule. The takeaway from all of this, though, if I was to say look to history for your lessons, is that not only does it have a rich and detailed history and its size and power, technology and governments were an example for all empires around them, they knew they were on top and they knew they were the best. And as you look at that, they're not like that right now. And they are not because they thought they were always the best. And someone else came along and wrecked them in the 19th century. And you're going to learn all about that their century of shame, as they call it. But the lesson from all of this is, one, you cannot be content at being the best because someone's going to try to beat you. And that's what they're doing right now. They're trying to play catch up. And historically speaking, they will. They have 4 times the population with us. And if once they fix their government system in a better way, they will be back to where they used to be. So just as a warning and understanding for us in the US, maybe we should learn more from ancient China. So anyway, that's my video. Hope you all have a good day. A little silly video afterwards, and see you later.
There's no way you're a teacher. Oh, okay.
Go ahead and use my ID to get into the building. If that doesn't convince you that I'm a teacher, look at the check I just got.